Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. This is Jeff Rumburg. I'm a managing partner with MetricNet, and I will be your presenter for today's webcast on outsourcing, megatrends, and best practices for IT service and support in 2023. I want to welcome all of you and thank you for participating in our webcast today. And I want to thank Bright Talk for inviting MetricNet to speak on this topic. Before we get started, I have just a few administrative announcements to make. During today's webcast, all of you will be in listen-only mode. But if you have any questions during the webcast, you will notice a questions button just below the image of my slides. During the webcast, you can click that button and type in your questions as the webcast progresses. I will wrap up my presentation a few minutes early to answer any questions that you've typed in during the webcast. Now, just by way of quick introduction, MetricNet's core business is metrics, benchmarking, and sourcing initiatives. We conduct IT service desk and desktop support benchmarks in virtually every industry, and we now have the largest database of IT process and performance indicators in the industry. Additionally, we have negotiated some of the largest IT outsourcing deals in the industry and continue to work with both managed service providers and clients to develop contracts that are mutually beneficial to both parties. If you're interested, you can download today's presentation as well as some associated attachments. Just click on the attachments button to gain access to those. We have 2 polls in our webcast today, so when those polls come up, we'll ask you to vote on those. And of course, when the webcast concludes, we'd like to hear your feedback, and we would ask you to rate our webcast and leave any feedback that you would like us to know about. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. First thing I want to point out is that everything you hear today is empirical in nature. It's based on the more than 4,000 benchmarks in IT service and support that MetricNet has completed over a 30-year period of time. We now have the largest global database of process and performance indicators, which includes more than 70 KPIs and a taxonomy of nearly 120 industry best practices. So everything you hear today has been observed in the industry multiple times. It's not academic, it's not theoretical, it's not hypothetical. It's based upon what we see in the industry day in, day out, best practices, what works, what doesn't work. We always like to get a feel for the demographics of our audience. So our first polling question allows us to understand those demographics, and we'd like to know, is your support organization insourced? Is it outsourced? Is it a hybrid, meaning that you're doing some of the work in-house and you've outsourced some of it? Or you might answer other or not applicable, in which case you might not be associated with a support organization, or you might be a consultant to the industry, for example. So I'll give you a few seconds to answer that. That will give us some insight into the demographics on our webcast today. Let's talk about why it's beneficial to engage in strategic partnerships with your vendor. A lot of these terms are cliche when you hear the term vendor partnership, strategic vendor partnership. The reality is very few outsourcing relationships are strategic in nature. And the win-win box, which is also a cliche, but everyone seems to talk about it, the idea that the customer wins and the vendor wins, that happens less than 5% of the time. There are many reasons for that, which we'll be discussing as we go through our webcast today. But let's first talk about when you get it right, when both the vendor and the customer gets it right. Some of the key benefits of that are improved first contact resolution rate, which in turn drives higher levels of customer satisfaction. Improved first level resolution rate, that's a different metric than FCR. So FLR means it's done at level 1, but not necessarily on first contact. It tends to be about 10 percentage points higher than first contact resolution rate. But as you improve your FLR, you will be shifting left and reducing your TCO, your total cost of ownership. Increased self-help, self-service. A vendor that is aligned with your objectives will be doing everything possible to help you shift left and drive volume into self-help, self-service. That reduces the agent-assisted ticket volumes, and it reduces the aggregate price that you would pay per ticket. Improved customer satisfaction will bring back disaffected users that may have been dissatisfied with their experiences with the service desk or desktop support in the past. And it will reduce and eliminate or minimize bypass. Bypass is when a customer bypasses the service desk or desktop support altogether, and they call their favorite person in IT and say, hey, can you help me out? I've got an issue here. We want to bring back those disaffected users, and we also want to prevent bypass as much as possible. Quicker resolution times is a big one, because the sooner you return a user to full service or full productivity, the more productive time they have and the less downtime they have. And it turns out that this is a significant part of the value proposition of any strategic vendor relationship, is that they restore the users to service as quickly as possible. So you think of resolution time, MTTR, mean time to resolve. In minimizing that MTTR, you are in effect returning productive hours to those end users. And then finally, mature problem management. Virtually every contract I've read in this industry talks about problem management and maturing the big three idle practices of incident knowledge and problem management, yet 100% of them do none of those things. I have yet to see a contract that fulfills on that promise to mature problem incident knowledge management. Problem management is particularly important because it allows an organization to reduce their ticket volume. And the best ticket is the ticket that's never placed, not because the user doesn't have the problem or doesn't trust the service desk, but because the problem has been eliminated from a root cause perspective. An effective vendor partnership will have a mature problem management process because they realize that the best thing for the client is to reduce the ticket volume, problem volume over time, thereby reducing both incident and service request volume. You put all this together, and what do you get is a dramatically improved ROI, return on investment. So if you're spending $10 million a year on your outsourcer, it's not unusual to get a 3, 4, 500% ROI, meaning that you get an economic benefit of 20 million, 30 million, 40 million, or possibly even 50 million on your $10 million investment in that vendor. And I'll explain how that ROI accumulates through the creation of economic value, through shift left, through channel mix, and by returning productivity to end users. But this is really what a strategic vendor partnership looks like. Why is it that only about 5% of all outsourcing relationships exhibit these characteristics? Well, it's because there's an inherent conflict of interest in virtually every vendor-customer relationship. By the way, let me just do a sidebar here. I'm neither pro nor con outsourcing. I have no axe to grind with outsourcing or managed service providers, but I do have a vested interest in both MSPs, managed service providers, and their customers having relationships that work, that are constructive, that add value, and that achieve all of the benefits that I showed you on the prior slide. That's my goal. So please don't interpret anything I say as being anti-outsourcer, anti-MSP. It's not that at all. What we want to see is outsourcing relationships that work, that benefit both parties equally, that get you into that win-win box, and that expand that win-win box from the measly 5% that it is now to something much larger than that. Here's the conflict of interest. If a vendor matures your problem management, they reduce your ticket volume, and they see that as less revenue for themselves. They see it as lower sales value in that contract. If they drive contacts into self-help, self-service, that again is less agent-assisted tickets for the vendor. They see that as a threat to their revenue stream. If they increase the FCR, that requires more training, and they also have to have more qualified analysts, which cost more. If they improve knowledge management, that's going to drive more volume into self-help, self-service, and it also reduces the handle time. And quicker resolution times, lower MTTR, will also over time reduce the agent headcount requirements. So we have this dilemma where the objective is to get into this strategic realm, the 5% win-win scenario for both agent and the customer, yet we have these built-in conflicts of interest. So how do we fix this? Well, we fix it by first defining what the problems are. And what I've listed here on slide 9 are the 11 most common reasons that outsourcing relationships fail. Most relationships are failing due to multiple reasons, not all 11 on this chart, but usually at least half a dozen of them. The first one is that the vendor tends to overpromise and then can't deliver on their commitments. We understand that vendors want to win business. We understand that they want to put their best foot forward, but in so doing, in many situations, they promise things that they simply cannot deliver. When that happens, both sides lose out. The vendor loses and the customer loses. So you've got a lose-lose scenario when that vendor overpromises. Well, the way you prevent that is to benchmark what the vendor is promising you to ascertain whether or not they can realistically achieve that. We've done hundreds of benchmarks for organizations over the years who are trying to determine just that, answer just that question, which is the vendor is telling us they can do X, Y, Z. Can they really do it? Let's look at the benchmarking data. Benchmarking data says, yes, it's possible. They would have to be a top quartile performer, or no, it's simply not possible. No one has been able to do that in the past. There's a lot of overpromising in this industry because there's a lot of overcapacity in the industry. In fact, it's been shown that the capacity of BPOs, business process outsourcers, managed service providers worldwide is about 2 times the demand for those services. So naturally, in a cutthroat environment like that, when the vendor is trying to win new business, they oftentimes will promise things that they simply can't deliver on. Let's talk about second common reason for these relationships failing. Hey, the client doesn't manage the vendor properly. In other words, governance. This is unfortunate because there's no such thing as a turnkey outsourcing relationship where you turn over your service desk or your desktop support or your field services to a vendor and say, take care of it, send us the monthly reports and everything will be fine. Unless you are actively involved in managing that vendor, the contract will fail. And so that's on the client. You may say, well, the vendor failed us, but if you fail the contract by not exercising proper governance, then you're at least, you as a customer, that is, or at least partially to blame. The good news is that governance is not a difficult thing in a vendor relationship, but there needs to be a point person. That is an individual who is responsible for overseeing the contract and, frankly, holding the vendor's feet to the fire on a daily, weekly, monthly basis so that they meet the requirements of the contract that you have signed. Third, vendors underprice contracts and fail to earn a profit for the reason I just mentioned, which is that there's so much capacity in this industry, so much overcapacity in this industry. Vendors frequently underprice their services. And once they begin to deliver the service and realize that they're break even at best or even losing money, what oftentimes happens is that they will hire the lowest cost resources they can. That is agent resources or supervisor resources. They go out and hire the lowest cost people they can. Problem is those individuals don't have a lot of experience in this industry. They don't necessarily have the education or the background to deliver technical support. And the relationship suffers as a result because the vendor's underperforming, the client's not getting what they want, vendor's not even earning a profit, or if they are, they're eking out a tiny profit. But this happens quite often. So what I tell our clients when we're working on their behalf, our customer clients, that is the customers of the managed service providers, is don't necessarily look for the lowest price, look for the best value. It's a combination of price and performance. Got to look for the best value. And I'll show you how you do that a little bit later in today's presentation using something called the balanced scorecard. So underpricing is very common in this industry. It doesn't benefit anybody. If you think you're getting a deal or a deal that's too good to be true, probably is too good to be true. Vendors fail to align with client goals and objectives. What do clients want? They want quick resolutions. They want a reduction in ticket volume over time. They want to see their TCO go down over time. They want to see the volume of tickets per user per month go down over time. Well, that's the conflict of interest that I spoke about 3 slides back. That is, when you're trying to do those things, oftentimes the vendor feels threatened by that because reducing ticket volumes on a per capita basis, deflecting contacts into lower cost agentless channels like self-help, self-service, and engaging in problem management, those are threatening to vendors because it means it's going to impact their revenue stream. But there's a way to get around that and develop pricing mechanisms that enable the vendor to maintain absolute profitability even when their revenue is dropping because the ticket volume is dropping. And I'll talk more about that later in the presentation. So we have this fundamental misalignment of goals and objectives because there's a fundamental conflict of interest built into every vendor-customer relationship. Another commonality is that vendor reports oftentimes have raw data. We all know that an ITSM system, doesn't matter which vendor it is, but the ITSM systems out there can now produce copious amounts of reports literally at the touch of a button. There's no shortage of data and reports coming out of telephony systems, Avaya, Cisco, Five9s, and the like, or out of ITSM systems, ServiceNow, Remedy, SolarWinds, and the like. There's no shortage of data that can be produced by those technologies, yet raw data doesn't do you much good. What you really need as a customer is diagnosis. What's the data telling you? Is it telling you that your overall performance trend is improving or getting worse? Is it telling you that price per contact is going up or down? Is it telling you that job satisfaction with the MSPs, agents, is going up or down? There's a lot of things that you need insight into, and generally the raw data reports that are produced by vendors in this industry don't have much diagnosis. They're simply trying to bury you with raw data that, quite frankly, most of the time they don't even understand. But there's a simple solution to that, and that is to cut out all the raw data and require the vendor to produce a limited number of standardized reports on a regular basis, daily, weekly, monthly. And the requirement on those reports is that they come with a bottom line conclusion. What's the diagnosis? What do we do about it? Next, the client doesn't understand the metrics in the vendor reports. That's kind of part of the same issue, that if you don't understand, for example, the difference between first contact resolution rate and first level resolution rate, if you don't know what shift left means, if you don't know why agent job satisfaction is important, if you don't know why agent turnover is important, then you're flying blind because you need to understand the metrics included in the vendor reports. That's the first step in holding the vendor accountable and ensuring that they're delivering reports that are diagnostic in nature and not just based on raw data. The other challenge is zero sum, meaning that if the vendor wins, the client loses, or if the client wins, the vendor loses. The win-win zone views this very differently. The win-win zone says that both parties can win, so it's not a zero-sum game. In other words, the vendor can do better at the same time that the client is doing better. So despite the fact that there are built-in conflicts of interest when it comes to a vendor delivering service to one or more clients, you don't have to fall into this zero-sum game trap. You can actually avoid those conflicts of interest. You can neutralize those conflicts of interest and get all the benefits that we stated back on slide number 5 or 6, the benefits of higher FCR, higher first level resolution rate, greater customer satisfaction, reduced ticket volume on a per customer basis, return productivity to end users, and so on. We also find that vendors love spinning data and reports in such a way that it casts them in a favorable light. One of the most common tricks here is to look at first contact resolution rate. Let's just say, for the sake of the argument, that a vendor is handling 10,000 tickets per month and they resolve 6,000 of those on first contact. That would be a 60% gross first contact resolution rate. But oftentimes contracts contain provisions for carve-outs that say, for example, that if you can't resolve it on first contact, for example, if it's a move, add, change, or if it's a hardware break fix or something like that, then you would carve those out of the denominator. Well, vendors take a great deal of liberty with those definitions, and they will essentially carve out virtually everything that they don't resolve on first contact and call it unresolvable on first contact. So they end up delivering a net first contact resolution rate of close to 100%, which is virtually impossible. Even an excellent FCR net first contact resolution rate would only be 90%. It wouldn't be anywhere near 100%. But vendors have all these tricks. And again, I'm not trying to cast aspersions on vendors. What I'm trying to do is bring vendors and buyers closer together in alignment so that both can win. But vendors are masters at spinning data to make themselves look good. And unless you have a facile knowledge, meaning a deep knowledge of metrics and diagnostics, it's very easy to be overcome by the minutia of the data and the reports that those vendors produce and fall prey to their interpretation of what those vendor reports are saying. Continuous improvement. I've sat through well over 1,000 vendor presentations when vendors are trying to win business, and they love to talk about continuous improvement. They have boilerplate, and it always is boilerplate, about continuous improvement in their proposals, but very rarely does continuous improvement actually manifest itself or is actually realized once the contract becomes operational. Continuous improvement would mean, for example, that over time your CSAT is going up, over time your first contact resolution rate is going up, and your first level resolution rate is going up. Over time your price per contact is going down. Over time the number of tickets per user per month is going down. That's what continuous improvement looks like. Vendors are very careful not to define it in that way, but they talk about it. They can write paragraph after paragraph about continuous improvement, but very rarely do we see it manifest itself in a live contract. Next, vendors experience high turnover. In fact, last year in North America, for outsourcing contracts, doesn't mean that the vendor was in North America, but what it means is that customers were in North America. The vendors in some cases were in the Philippines or India or Mexico or Canada or the United States or Eastern Europe or Western Europe. The vendors were all over the place, but many of them experience high turnover. And in fact, the turnover amongst BPOs and MSPs is always much higher than enterprise turnover. So if you're running your own internal service desk, your annual agent turnover might be 35%, whereas the vendor's annual agent turnover might be closer to 70, 80, 90%, sometimes even more than 100%. Vendors experience extremely high turnover. Some of this is because they don't pay their agents well. Some of it is because they don't provide very good training or career opportunities for their agents. Some of it is job hopping on the part of agents. They go to the next job that pays them a little bit more. There's a lot of reasons why vendors will experience this high turnover. Another important one is that vendors will oftentimes start a new contract with their A team. That is their best agents. And after a few weeks or even a few months, they start peeling the A team away and move them onto other new projects. And what they leave behind is the second stringers, the third stringers, that is the B and the C team, not as qualified, not as experienced, not as competent as the A team was. And that also contributes to turnover. But high turnover, make no mistake about it, costs the buyers money, and it costs you credibility in the eyes of the customer, because generally when there's a high turnover environment, the knowledge and expertise is walking out the door every day, and your first contact resolution rate suffers, and as a result, your customer satisfaction will suffer. Finally, and by the way, these are the 11 most common reasons that these relationships fail. They're not the only ones. There are hundreds of reasons that contribute to the failure of an MSP and customer relationship, but these are the most common 11. The last one being that vendors don't adequately train their personnel. And this is particularly true in certain vertical markets. If you've outsourced your support and you're a healthcare provider, or you've outsourced your support and you're in the insurance industry, or you're in the transportation industry, customers, or I should say, agents need to know more than just how to resolve tickets, reset passwords, provide Microsoft Office support, provide Outlook support, and so on. They oftentimes need to have a deep knowledge of the vertical market that they're operating within. And that's missing in most relationships. In other words, the agents that work in insurance don't know anything about insurance. The agents that work in healthcare don't know anything about healthcare. The agents that work in transportation know nothing about transportation. But it turns out that that industry knowledge, that vertical knowledge and expertise is extremely valuable. So at the very least, almost 100% of outsourcers are not training their agents in the vertical market that they operate in, and even on the basics, the applications and infrastructure they support. The agents are oftentimes not adequately trained, and that in turn leads to additional turnover and absenteeism. So there's a lot of headwinds when it comes to entering into a relationship with a vendor. These headwinds don't work in your favor. They create situations where you have an impossible situation where the vendor is promised a certain level of performance. The buyer, the customer, is expecting that level of performance. They don't get it. And so both sides end up being dissatisfied in a relationship like that. Let me start with some things that you can think about and do in order to improve an existing vendor relationship or enter into fruitful and productive vendor relationships in the future. Very first thing is to ask for, if you're a customer, a credible value proposition. And if you're a supplier, an MSP, or a business process outsourcer, you can deliver a credible value proposition. I mentioned earlier that I've sat through thousands of these presentations, and I've yet to see a credible value proposition. What I hear is a lot of cliches, a lot of talk about maturing idle processes, a lot of talk about artificial intelligence and machine learning, a lot of talk about chatbots and voice bots, a lot of talk about contact volume reduction or ticket reduction, yet none of it comes to fruition. What customers want to hear and what vendors should be saying is that we're going to help drive your volume into lower cost channels. So away from voice and into chat, email, self-help, self-service, for example, that averages down your cost per ticket. They want to hear that the vendors have a credible plan for shifting left, that is moving tickets from the field or desktop support to level 1 support and moving tickets from level 1 support to problem management, that is eliminating them altogether, or into self-help, self-service. So they want to hear about problem management and incident reduction. They want to hear how you're going to make their users more productive. What is your ROI as a vendor? And how do you plan to make that ROI well in excess of 100%? That's what a real value proposition looks like. I've yet to see one in this industry. And unfortunately, there's a lot of acronyms that get made up by individual managed service providers. There's a lot of talk about continuous improvement. There's a lot of talk about AI and machine learning and how the client is going to learn your environment and eventually eliminate all the labor associated with delivering service and support, yet that never materializes. The credible value proposition is as simple as this. We will drive your ticket volume into lower cost channels. We will shift left to reduce your TCO. We will have a robust problem management system to reduce the volume of tickets per user per month over time. And we will quantify the number of hours of productivity that we return to your end users. It's pretty straightforward. It's very simple, but it's also very realistic. Shift left reduces TCO as illustrated in this diagram. This shows for 2022 what the average fully loaded cost of a ticket is at different levels within an organization. If you have a vendor resolving a ticket, it's close to $600 a ticket. If a field services ticket is resolved, it's close to $221 when fully loaded. And by the way, these are just averages. The standard deviation around these numbers is quite large. So for example, vendor support, we've seen vendor support tickets resolved for $50, and we've seen vendor support tickets resolved for $25,000. We've seen field support tickets resolved for $25, and we've seen them resolved for $10,000. We've seen IT support spend weeks on a ticket and resolve it for $5,000 or $6,000. We've seen them resolve for $10. So these are averages. I don't want to lead you to believe that these are the absolute numbers that you will see on a cost basis per ticket, fully loaded cost per ticket, but these are the averages. So level 1 service desk last year, fully loaded cost was about $22 a ticket. Self-help, self-service, when you drive volume through that channel, you still have some capital cost up front. That is, you have an investment that gets amortized over the volume of tickets that you drive through that channel, and the average cost is about $2 a ticket. Problem management is hard to quantify because what you're doing is preventing tickets. And so really, by preventing tickets, if you prevent, say, 1,000 tickets a month or 10,000 tickets per month, what did you do? Well, you returned the productivity loss associated with those 1,000 or 10,000 tickets, you return that productivity to the end user. And that's a significant part of the ROI that a managed service provider can deliver. And then finally, for the first time last year, we felt comfortable putting level -2 on this chart. This is AI and machine learning, seek and destroy, search and destroy. That is, identify anomalies in the IT environment before they produce tickets, before they create an incident or a service request. So level -2 would be your AI and machine learning. Level -1 would be your root cause analysis or problem management, and so on. So you can see how shift left will reduce your TCO over time if you can turn a desktop ticket into a service desk ticket, or move the service desk ticket into self-help, or eliminate it through problem management. That reduces your total cost of ownership over time. Now, in the extreme, you can potentially reduce your IT service and support cost by 50% or more if you're serious about shifting left. And for service providers, that is the BPOs and the MSPs that are in this industry that talk about shifting left, very rarely do we see it actually manifest itself. But if they're serious about this, you should see a 10%, at least on an annual basis, 10% year-over-year reduction in tickets per user. What are some of the other ways that value is created? Well, you can deflect contacts into lower cost channels. You can see here what the cost per channel is for what the volume of tickets is by channel. The percentage of tickets that are resolved in voice has been steadily decreasing, while chat, web submitted, email, walk-up, and self-service tickets have been increasing. There are two drivers here. One is economic. That is, if you deflect away from voice, you can go into lower cost channels. Chat is lower cost, web is lower cost, email is lower cost. And of course, self-help, self-service is going to be lower cost than voice. So you got a very powerful economic driver here. Driving volume into lower cost channels helps reduce your total cost of ownership. The other driver is demographic. That is, as newer workers enter the workplace, they don't want to transact business in the voice or chat channel. They would rather do self-service. They would rather maybe submit a ticket by the web. But most likely they're going to try and Google a solution or ask somebody that works close to them, what's the solution here? So we've got both economic and demographics driving this trend. But the reality is, as you deflect contacts into lower cost channels, you will average down your cost per ticket. And an effective vendor that's operating with you strategically in that win-win space will allow this to happen. Let's look at problem management. In organizations that practice active problem management, the average number of tickets per user per month is 1.03. Those are the orange diamonds or orange squares. The blue dots, data points, are for organizations that are not engaged in active problem management. Those enterprises have an average of 1.3 tickets per user per month. So you can see that just on the averages, if you're engaged in active problem management, you will have about 30% fewer tickets on a per user basis. That's the value of problem management. And an effective vendor is going to help make this happen. They will engage in problem management so as to reduce the total ticket volume over time. And that in turn reduces the impact on productivity to end users and should reduce your price over time, the price that you pay to your managed service provider. The biggest contributor to ROI, and the one that almost every vendor misses, in fact, 100% of vendors miss this. I like to ask the question when I'm sitting on the other side of a table from a vendor that is advocating for the buyer. I like to ask him, what's the most important strategic goal of IT service and support? The answers I get range from, to maximize customer satisfaction, or to improve the net promoter score, or to maximize first contact resolution rate, or to minimize the speed of answer. No one ever gets this question right. But the number one goal of IT service and support is to minimize the productivity loss of the end users. Turned around, it's return as many productive hours as you possibly can to end users. So by restoring users to service as quickly as possible and preventing as many incidents and service requests as possible, you're returning productive time to those end users. And this turns out to be the biggest contributor to ROI in service and support. And what we're showing on this chart is data from benchmarks that we did. There were 60 separate benchmarks, and we were able to demonstrate empirically that the higher the quality of support that is delivered to the customer, the fewer productive hours are lost by that customer on an annual basis. So if you're unlucky enough to work in an organization with fourth quartile service and support, you're going to lose about 47 productive hours per user per year. That's huge. That's a full week and a day. By contrast, if you're lucky enough to work in an organization that delivers top quartile IT service and support, your end users are going to lose about 17 productive hours per year. That's still 2 days. It's not insignificant, but it's a whole lot better than 6 days or 7 days. So the idea here is that the higher the quality of support is, the less productive time will be lost by your users. Effective MSPs, managed service providers, and business process outsourcers understand this value proposition. And they understand the value of shift left channel mix and returning productivity to end users. And if they're doing their job, they'll be computing at least an annual ROI for you, but even better, calculating a monthly ROI to demonstrate that whatever you're spending on them, the return that they're producing for you from channel mix, from deflection of voice contacts into lower cost channels, and by returning productivity to end users, the value that they create there is worth far more than what you're spending with them. Yet none of the vendors are doing this. So it's quite a shock to know that this industry, which is now about 40 years old, I have yet to see a credible value proposition, and I've yet to see a vendor talk realistically about shift left and actually shifting left and deflecting contacts into lower cost channels and demonstrating that and returning productivity to end users by reducing ticket volume and by restoring to service MTTR, that is restore to services, or RTS, return to service, as quickly as possible. Let me share some benchmarking data with you. This is 20 recent outsourcing contracts in North America, and I'm showing just 4 metrics here. Clearly, a contract needs to have more metrics than this, and I'll show you what those metrics should look like. But in an effort to look at how the performance disparities manifest themselves from one outsourcing contract to the next, what we've listed are 20 clients of MetricNet's. We've shown the price per ticket they pay, the customer satisfaction they receive, the first contact resolution rate, and the average speed of answer. So how do we know who got the best value here? I mean, we could kind of pour through the data and try and figure out what's going on here. But an easier way would be to put this data into a balanced scorecard. So we've got the 4 metrics in the left-hand column: price per ticket, customer satisfaction, first contact resolution rate, and average speed of answer. Those are the 4 metrics that make up this very simple scorecard. We put equal weighting on each metric just for the sake of illustration. You can put any weightings you want on your vendor scorecard. You can put any metrics you want in your vendor scorecard. But then we would put a typical range, and by the way, this range here, worst case, best case, came from the prior chart. So if you look at that prior chart, you'll see that the worst price per ticket was $37.38, and the best price per ticket was $15.28. And that's true of all 4 metrics in this scorecard. Then what we've done on this particular scorecard, just for illustrative purposes, is we put the averages for the 4 metrics from the prior page in this your actual performance column. We calculate a metric score using an interpolation formula, and then we come up with a single overall balanced score. Now, if we run each of those 20 contracts from the prior page through this simple scorecard, what we get is a distribution of balanced scores, the highest balanced score being about 80%. That's over on the far left, company number 14. The lowest balanced score over on the far right, that's company number 4. Their balanced score is only 29.2%. The average of these balanced scores is 53.2%. That's the red dashed line. Here's the value of this, and I alluded to this earlier. when I was talking about having benchmarks to evaluate the veracity, the claims that your BPO or MSP is making. If they're telling you that they can deliver a certain level of service, you need to apply some benchmarks against that to ascertain whether or not, A, can they realistically do this? And B, how would it compare to benchmarking data? Are they top quartile, second quartile, third quartile, or fourth quartile? Well, it turns out the winner here is company number 14. The loser here is company number 4. Let's go back and look at company number 14. Let's look at their raw data. We can see that they're paying $24.59 per ticket. Their customer satisfaction is 91.6%. Their first contact resolution rate is 85.4%, and their ASA is 54 seconds. Given the balanced scorecard algorithm that we just went through, they ended up with the best deal. In other words, they scored best on this balanced scorecard algorithm. So here's a couple of takeaways from this. The number one takeaway is whenever a vendor is telling you they can do something, you should compare it to benchmarks to determine whether or not those claims are credible. Can they really do it? Can they really achieve the performance that they told you that they can achieve? Second thing is that on a monthly basis, your vendor should be producing a scorecard like this. They should be showing you how your performance compares to others in your industry or vertical market, and they should be giving you a trend over time, not just a trend in your speed of answer or your price per ticket or your customer satisfaction or your first contact resolution rate, but rather a trend in your overall scorecard. Now, this is real data from a MetricNet client. The dark blue bars represent the monthly balance scores, and the green background represents a trailing 12-month average. Now, if a vendor shows this to me, I say, well, this looks good because the trend is in the upward direction. It doesn't go up every month, it doesn't go down every month, but overall, you're trending in the right direction. How many vendors actually produce a scorecard for their customers? 0, unless you ask them. You have to ask them to produce this for you, because this gives you a single overall measure of your performance compared to others in the industry. Outsourcing relationships fail for many reasons. I've listed the 11 most common reasons that outsourcing relationships fail. But here's a couple things you can do almost immediately, whether you're just getting into an outsourcing relationship or thinking about getting into an outsourcing relationship, or you're already in one. And by the way, if you're already in one, there's no reason you can't renegotiate that contract any time of the day or night. Don't let, given the 100% overcapacity in this industry, it's a false premise that, oh, you have to wait till the contract expires before you renegotiate with your customer, or with your vendor, I should say. As a customer, I've seen the attendance list for today's webcast. Most of you are Global 2000 companies. You have an enormous amount of buying power. It's perfectly acceptable if you don't like the level of performance that your supplier is delivering, to say, hey, we need to talk about this. We need to fix the performance. We need to rehabilitate the performance, and we need to change some terms of the contract. That's perfectly acceptable. You don't have to wait until the contract expires. Exercise your buyer power. And even if you're not a Global 2000 company, exercise your buyer power and recognize the fact that there's 100% overcapacity in this industry. And if you don't like what your supplier is delivering, tell them how they can fix it, and then tell them that you want to improve, whether it's lower price, higher quality of service, more shift left, more problem management, whatever it might be. There's no reason you can't do that right now. You don't have to wait for some magical contract expiration date or anything like that. So these are the 11 maladies that are the most common. They're the ones to avoid. The 2 things you can do right now, whether you're in a vendor relationship or getting ready to enter into one, or you've got a contract coming up for expiration, or you're about to release an RFP, the metrics that a vendor should be reporting to you on a monthly basis are summarized here on page 30. There's about 20 metrics here in total. They should be giving you the price and quality metrics that are shown, the productivity, the analyst service level, and call handling metrics. When they balk at reporting their analyst metrics, it's just an excuse. You need to know what their turnover is. You need to know what their absenteeism is. You need to know what their job satisfaction is, because that tells you everything you need to know about how well they are managing their analysts. So the analyst metrics in particular are not very common to report in MSP or BPO contracts, but you should insist on it. You're the buyer, you should get what you want. So at the very least, your contract should include the metrics that are shown on this page. The other thing you can do is think about these strategic requirements. At the very least, on an annual basis, your supplier should be reducing your ticket volume by 10%. And that would be tickets per user per month, okay? Because your user population may be growing. Now, if your user population is growing at 20% per year, it's going to be hard to reduce the total ticket volume by 10%. But on a per capita basis, minimum of 10% year-over-year ticket reduction, price reduction, minimum 10% year-over-year. Why? Well, if you're reducing ticket volume 10%, you should see a price reduction of 10%. Shift left, minimum of 10% year-over-year. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that 10% of your level 1 service desk tickets should be moving to the left, either self-help, self-service, or eliminated through problem management. If you have field services or desktop support, a minimum of 10% of those tickets should be pushed to the left to level 1 support. And then channel mix. At the very least, 10% of your voice volume should go away every year and be handled in lower cost channels, such as chat, email, web submitted tickets, or self-help, self-service. These are things you can do right away. You can call your vendor up this afternoon and say, I want to see these metrics reported monthly. And secondly, on an annual basis, we want to see these improvements in ticket volume, price, shift left, and channel mix deflection. Now, I'll warn you ahead of time, your vendors aren't going to like it because they don't like being held accountable. Recall that one of the 11 most common issues is that clients fail to exercise proper governance. Proper governance doesn't just mean holding the vendor accountable to the contract, but it means acting as an advocate for the enterprise that you represent. And if you're not getting the quality of service that you think you should be getting, it's perfectly acceptable to tell the vendor exactly what you want. And if they don't like it, that's their problem. I hate to say it, but the key is you got to be clear about what you want. You got to require this from your vendor, and that's simply part of good governance. So in a moment, I'm going to take some questions, but before I do, I've got a final poll that I'm going to ask you to respond to. And this poll gives you an opportunity to schedule a free consultation with MetricNet. So let's go ahead and open that poll. And we can call you this afternoon. This will be a consultation with me personally. So if you're interested in 20 minutes, 30 minutes of my time, ask me any question you want. I'm not going to give you a sales pitch, but any question is fair game when it comes to IT service and support. So if you'd like to schedule that consultation with MetricNet, just answer in the affirmative, either yes, ASAP, or yes, next week. Okay, I'm going to close that poll down. Thanks to those who responded to that. We'll get in touch with you to schedule a time for those that answered in the affirmative. Now on our website, you're going to find a number of educational resources for service and support professional. These include things like a service desk headcount calculator. We've got some free downloadable ebooks that define the most important metrics for IT service and support, both for service desk and for desktop support. We've got a performance targets calculator. We've also got an ROI calculator and a balanced scorecard template. So these resources are available. These and hundreds more resources are available to you on MetricNet's website. Now, keep in mind that our webcasts are always free of charge. And if you like what you've heard today, I want to encourage you to go to our website to sign up for future webcasts. Later this month, we have a webcast on the success factors for hybrid work environment, meaning combination of work in the office, work at home. What do those success factors look like? You can download today's presentation and the associated attachments by clicking on the attachments button. And we ask you to rate our webcast and leave us any feedback that you would like as you exit the webcast. Let's now take a look at the questions we have. Okay, first question. If only 5% of outsourcing relationships work, why would anyone roll the dice against being part of the 95%? And following on that, assuming you do in some circumstances recommend outsourcing, what is your success rate for whatever failures you've had? Why did they fail, assuming you shared with the customer all the key components? Okay, so if only 5% of outsourcing relationships work, why would anyone roll the dice on being part of the against being part of the 95%. It's because they don't know the statistics. It's because they don't know that only 5% of outsourcing relationships succeed. So why would anybody do it? Because they simply don't know that the deck is stacked against them, and they go into it with the assumption that the relationship is going to succeed. And so that's why they simply don't know that the vast majority of outsourcing relationships are failing. And following on that, assuming you do in some circumstances recommend outsourcing, what is your success rate for whatever failures you've had? Why did they fail? Assuming you shared with the customer all the key components. We do, in some circumstances, recommend outsourcing. As an example, we have clients that are not doing a great job of providing commodity support. Think of password resets, Microsoft Office, Windows, Outlook support, that kind of thing. That can be delivered very effectively from offshore at a very low cost. And if we are involved in those contract negotiations, in writing the contract and negotiating with the supplier, those relationships do succeed. Now, the reason I selected that particular use case, that is commodity support, is because if you're going offshore for support, in my, well, it's not just my opinion, it's the empirical data that supports it. Supporting a vertical market like higher education or insurance or healthcare, it's very difficult to provide quality support from offshore because it's very difficult to learn that vertical market when you're not co-located with the customer. So we don't recommend for complex application and infrastructure support, we generally do not recommend outsourcing unless the outsourcer is co-located with the business. When the outsourcer is co-located with the business, that is, they're sitting amongst those that work in insurance or transportation or healthcare or higher education, yes, those agents can learn the vertical market over time, but outsourcing either onshore at a different location or offshore almost never works. So to answer your question about, those that we've advised on outsourcing, if we wrote the contract and the client follows our advice, 100% of those are in the win-win category. And that's why we win business. And this is why it's a growing part of our business at MetricNet, is to advise clients on how to enter into these win-win relationships. And by the way, as I said, I'm not anti-outsourcing. We advocate for outsourcers as often as we advocate for clients. So if we're advocating for the outsourcer, we want to help them win business, but we want them to do it in a way that they can meet all the claims in the contract that they sign. And conversely, when we're advocating for the customers, we want to ensure that the customer gets everything that they thought they were getting in the contract that they sign. Next question, is there a source that can be referenced which highlights the success rate / percentage of successful versus unsuccessful? Not that I know of. But we're using empirical data going back 30 years, and the 5% number that I've shared with you, I suspect this question is coming from the same person as the last question. I'm unaware of any reference other than the MetricNet database, which is the largest in the industry in terms of outsourcing contracts and the success failure rate of those outsourcing contracts. So I'm not aware of any published numbers from Gartner or Forrester or anybody like that. Gartner, where I spent 12 years of my career, I'm not aware of any statistics published on that 5% success versus 95% failure rate, but we know empirically from the customers as well as the BPOs we've worked with that that's the approximate number. There's a person that said, I don't see the slides on the attachments tab. Are you going to post them? Yes, if we haven't posted them yet, we will do so because we want you to have access to those slides. Next question, during RFP, are all vendors going through the benchmarking initiative you mentioned early on that helps show if each vendor is able to deliver on promises? The RFP is a request for proposal, and generally what happens is that an RFP will be released to anywhere from 4 to 10 vendors by a prospective buyer, by a prospective customer. Okay, those 4 to 6 vendors will write a proposal, send it in. Usually it's very quick and easy to kind of down select to 3 or 4 that look the most credible. Sometimes it's only 2 or 3 that look the most credible. But the vendors are not the ones doing the benchmarking. It's the buyers, that is the customers, that are doing the benchmarking. and taking the claims that are made by these vendors and running them through a benchmark to see, is this even realistic? Can they achieve a 20-second ASA and a 95% CSAT and a 90% FCR? I'm just making these numbers up to give you an extreme example of when a vendor cannot meet all those performance requirements and deliver it for $5 per ticket. Okay, that's not going to happen. Okay, so it's not the vendors that are doing the benchmarks, it's the buyer that's doing the benchmark to ascertain the veracity of the claims that the vendor is making. So it's not during the RFP process, but rather once the proposals are submitted to the prospective customer, that benchmarks will be performed to look at the value proposition of each one of the vendors that's bidding on the business. Next question. What should we do if the MSP refuses to provide references but provides anonymous case studies instead? My advice is run away. If they don't have references that you can talk to and they give you these generic case studies, hit the road. I would eliminate them from consideration. Is there a specific pricing model we should be looking at? For example, fixed fee per call or fixed fee per user? Yes, there is a specific pricing model that you should look at. It's generally it would be fixed fee per user. And the reason that's the best model is because if a vendor is being paid on a per call or per ticket basis, their incentive is more tickets. We want more tickets. We want more tickets. So they're not going to be doing problem management. They're not going to be doing shift left. They just want to maximize the number of tickets they have because they're paid per ticket. But on a per user basis, let's just say your user base is fixed at 20,000, over the course of a year. Okay, if they're paid per user, they have every incentive to deliver high quality service, but reduce the number of tickets per user. Why? Because they're still paid a fixed amount per user. It might be $20 per user per month, or $30 or $40 or $50 per user per month. But if that vendor can reduce the ticket volume through problem management, they end up ahead because they get paid the same amount per head count, but they're handling fewer tickets. So they're engaged in problem management like crazy to reduce the ticket volume. They're doing all sorts of things to shift left and deflect contacts into lower cost channels because they get the same amount per user. Okay, so fixed fee per user is actually a better pricing mechanism than fixed fee per call or per ticket. But even better than those two pricing mechanisms is one that I've written about a couple of times. I didn't show it in this presentation just due to time constraints, but rather it's fixed profit over on an annual basis with the expectation that the vendor is going to reduce the ticket volume over time, reduce the price over time. And I showed you those, 10% year over year reduction in ticket volume per capita, 10% year over year reduction in price, and so on. There's a way to do that where the buyer's paying a lower price every year, but the vendor's profits remain fixed. I'll save that for a separate webcast. I have written a white paper about this. It's a pricing mechanism that's in use in a limited number of relationships because vendors don't like it. Customers are thrilled about it because it gives everybody the right incentive. And it doesn't have the vendor hoping for more ticket volume, doesn't have the vendor pretending to do problem management when they really aren't doing problem management. It's a pricing mechanism that keeps the vendor's profits constant, but reduces their revenue and thereby reduces the price paid by the buyer. Everybody wins with this pricing mechanism. Next question, to what degree does the customer get involved with staffing and outsourced service desk? Well, that really depends on what agreement is entered into between the customer and the outsourcer. Sometimes the customer will actually provide resources to the outsourcer. It might be a limited number of resources. It might be a manager. It might be some supervisors. It might even be some agents, in which case you've got a hybrid desk that is partially outsourced. But in general, when it comes to staffing decisions, that's up to the outsourcer. And I'm somewhat against the idea of the customer dictating to the outsourcer what headcount they should have. It's fine for them to dictate what the hiring requirements are, what experience level should those agents and analysts have. But in terms of determining the headcount, I believe that should be up to the outsourcer. They're the ones that should be doing the workforce scheduling. They're the ones that should be responsible for ensuring that they're staffed properly during call spikes or email spikes and the like. So the answer is it varies. It really depends upon the relationship between the outsourcer and the customer. But in general, we believe that it's appropriate to allow the outsourcer to decide what their staffing should be. And if they fall short on staffing or are not staffed properly or don't schedule properly, then a lot of KPIs are going to be impacted negatively. Your customer satisfaction is going to drop, your abandoned calls will increase, your ASA will go up, your CSAT will go down. There's a lot of repercussions, negative repercussions, when a vendor doesn't staff properly. Now, I believe that the customer should have visibility into the vendor staffing levels so that you can diagnose when the vendor is unwilling to admit that they don't have enough agents or that they have too many agents, whatever the case might be. I think you should have visibility as a client into what their staffing looks like. But I think the decision on staffing should be left up to the vendor. Next question, is the problem with problem that it's not part of the contractual agreement or it just never gains traction? It's the latter. So let me sort of interpret this question a little bit. The problem with problem management is not that it's in the contract, it's that the vendor just doesn't like doing it. Now, for enterprise service desks, if any of you have been involved in problem, incident, or knowledge management, you know that almost 100% of the time those initiatives fail. And I'm sorry to be so negative, but that's the reality. Those big three idle practices never succeed, partly because there's so much turnover in IT service and support. So somebody might be put in charge of problem management or incident or knowledge management, and a year later they're onto some other position. And so you have this constant turnover and you never really gain traction there. Not only that, but generally a person who's responsible for one of those big idle practices, it's not their core responsibility. They have other jobs, they have other things that they're responsible for. So when enterprises try and do problem, incident, or knowledge management, they almost never devote the proper resources to it. So it never gains traction internally. The reason it doesn't gain traction with outsourcers is because of that conflict of interest I spoke about earlier, whereby as they engage in problem management, reduce the number of tickets on a per capita basis monthly, to them that looks like less revenue. It looks like fewer sales. So there's kind of 3 or 4 headwinds working against effective problem management. If you're trying to do it internally yourself in an enterprise, generally the high turnover and the lack of dedicated or allocated time to problem management prevents problem management from succeeding. And when you're asking the vendor to do it, they generally see a conflict of interest in doing that. So it's really only when you're holding the vendor's feet to the fire, and you're holding them accountable to the contract. And by the way, I've reviewed thousands of contracts and 100% of them are out of compliance. Some of them not significantly out of compliance, but most of them are significantly out of compliance. And a lot of that is on the soft requirements like problem management, incident management, knowledge management, ticket reduction, shift left. Those are harder things to measure. But yeah, the problem with problem management is that if you're doing it internally, typically you just don't have the expertise and the resources to do it right. And if you're asking a vendor to do it, you're asking them to do something that does in fact represent a conflict of interest. Okay, let me just, I think there's 1 or 2, like maybe 3 final questions here. Is there a source? No, not that question. Okay, can you share a sample contract that includes the metrics you've recommended? No, I can't do that. That's part of the intellectual property that MetricNet has developed over many years, and we share that with paying clients. So if you become a paying client, yes, we can share that contract with you. Next question. Was the presentation recorded and will it be available for later viewing? The answer is yes. It will be available on our website. Next question. Is there a typical life cycle for how long companies exercise outsourcing options before determining to bring them back in-house? Not really. Most outsourcing contracts are 3 to 5 years, or 3 years with 2 one-year renewal clauses. That's what a typical outsourcing contract should look like. But every contract contains an out, which says that if the vendor is failing miserably, that you have an out. You can get out of that outsourcing contract. So in terms of exercising your option, to bring a service desk or desktop support or field services back in-house, you can probably do that just about any time if the vendor is failing to perform. So nobody likes to, pull that card because it's a fairly harsh remedy. But the fact is, even though 3 to 5 years is a typical contract life cycle, we see contracts pulled all the time early because the vendor is failing to perform. And sometimes you have to do that because vendors simply can't live up to the terms of the contract. Next question. If a company only outsources service desk services and the rest of IT infrastructure services is retained by the company, can the IT vendor responsible for service desk services reasonably be expected to have the control to drive down ticket volume per user? Yes, of course they can. Because if they have control over level one and they can get to root causes on level one incidents and eliminate those root causes, then absolutely they can be responsible for problem management. So I see no constraints there. It might be a little bit easier if they have the help of some of the level 2, level 3 IT folks within the organization so that they can diagnose why those root causes exist and hence eliminate those root causes. But absolutely, a vendor that's responsible for level 1 can absolutely be held accountable for reducing ticket volume through problem management / root cause analysis. Okay, that was the last of our questions. I want to thank everyone for joining me today for our discussion on best practices and megatrends in IT outsourcing. A lot of great questions. I want to thank you so much for that. This concludes our webcast today. I hope to see you all on next month's webcast.